200 Comanche warriors do not appear at a man's barn by chance. They come for vengeance, for justice, or for war. And Thaddeus Bear Maulister was about to learn which of those had found him. But to understand how it reached that point, you have to go back to where it truly began. 24 hours earlier, the Texas sun was beating down without mercy on Bear's ranch, sitting somewhere between Amarillo and nowhere at all, when he first noticed the small shape staggering across his land. At 34, Bear had dealt with more trouble than most men his age during his years working cattle, but something about that morning felt off. Wrong, even. He had been repairing a snapped fence post near the creek when a flicker of movement caught his attention. A child, no more than 8 or 9 years old, was weaving toward the water in uneven, desperate steps. The clothes hanging from the child's frame were torn and worn, traditional Native American garments that had clearly seen far better days. Even from that distance, Bear could tell hunger was dragging each step out of her like a burden. Most ranchers in this country would have reached for a rifle before taking a second look, asking questions only after smoke cleared. Settlers and the local Comanche had lived on a knife's edge for years, raids answered by counter-raids, fear feeding fear. But Bear had always been different, maybe foolishly so. He set his tools down and approached slowly, hands out where they could be seen, every movement careful. As he closed the distance, he realized the child was a girl. Her dark eyes looked far too large in her thin face, lips split and dry from thirst. She stared up at him with a mix of terror and pleading that hit him hard in the chest. She spoke quickly in Comanche, words he couldn't understand, but the meaning needed no translation. She was starving, likely hadn't eaten for days. Her small hands motioned toward her mouth, then toward the creek, a simple language of need that crossed any boundary. Bear thought of his neighbors and what they would say if they saw him helping a Comanche child. He remembered the warnings whispered in town, the talk of rising tensions. He considered the sensible choice, the safe one. Then he looked into her eyes again and made the choice that would unravel everything. Without speaking, Bear lifted the girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. She did not struggle, too weak to resist even if she had wanted to. As he carried her toward his cabin, he felt her slight body shaking, whether from fear, hunger, or both he could not tell. Inside the small cabin, Bear gently set her onto his only chair and hurried to prepare food. There was stew left from the night before, still warm on the stove, and fresh bread he had baked that morning. The scent alone seemed to stir her, and for the first time he saw something like hope flicker in her eyes. As Bear poured the stew into a bowl, his gaze caught on something that sent a chill through him. Around the girl's neck, half hidden beneath torn cloth, hung a necklace of intricate beadwork, patterns he recognized instantly. Just days earlier, his neighbor Pete Morrison had described those exact designs. They were ceremonial beads worn by the family of Chief White Bull, the most powerful Comanche leader in the region. Bear's hand froze midair. If he was right, he wasn't simply feeding a lost child. He was sheltering the daughter of a man who could summon 200 warriors without effort. Still, it was too late to turn back. The girl was already reaching for the bowl with trembling hands, and Bear could not bring himself to refuse her. He gave her the food and watched as she ate with the frantic urgency of someone long denied a meal. What Bear did not know was that 20 miles away, a Comanche search party had discovered her trail leading straight to his ranch, and Chief White Bull himself rode at its head, his face carved with fury and grief that promised disaster for whoever stood in his way. After she finished eating, the girl looked up at Bear with what might have been gratitude. As the afternoon shadows stretched across the land, Bear felt a weight settle in his gut. He could not shake the sense that he had just made either the best decision of his life or the final one. Within an hour, exhaustion claimed the girl and she slept in the chair. Bear draped his only blanket over her and tried to reassure himself that he had done what was right. But as evening crept closer, that confidence began to crack. The sound of hooves on the dirt road made his stomach tighten. Bear looked through the window and saw his neighbor Cletus Hartwell riding hard toward the cabin, flanked by 2 men Bear knew well, Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison and Reverend Thomas. Bear stepped outside before they dismounted, hoping to keep things quiet and not wake the girl, but Cletus was already yelling before his horse fully stopped. "Bear, you damned fool, what in hell are you thinking?" Cletus's face burned with anger and something close to fear. "Morrison says he spotted smoke signals in the hills today. The Comanche are searching for something, or someone." Deputy Morrison nodded grimly. "My father sent word from town. Chief White Bull's daughter vanished 3 days ago during a hunting trip. They say she wandered off in a storm." His eyes stayed on Bear's face. "You wouldn't know anything about a missing Comanche girl, would you?" Bear's mouth went dry. The sensible move would have been to lie, to send them away and handle it himself. But these men had been his neighbors for years, and they had come out of concern. "She's inside," Bear said quietly. "Half-starved. I couldn't leave her to die." The silence that followed felt crushing. Reverend Thomas finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "Son, do you realize what you've done?" "I helped a hungry child," Bear replied, though even to his own ears it sounded painfully naive. Cletus began pacing, dragging his hands through his hair. "They'll think you took her." "Hell, they probably already do. White Bull has wiped out whole settlements for less than this." Deputy Morrison was already backing toward his horse. "I have to report this, Bear. It's my duty. But I'll give you a head start. Get her back to her people before they find you." "In the dark?" Bear asked. "She can barely stand. And how do I walk into a Comanche camp without getting filled with arrows?" "That's your problem now," Morrison said as he mounted. "I'm riding to warn the town. If White Bull makes an example of you, he won't stop at your ranch." As they rode off, Bear stood alone in the thickening dusk, listening to the girl's soft breathing inside the cabin. He thought about saddling his horse and trying to find the Comanche camp, knowing it would be suicide. He thought about loading her into his wagon and heading for town, knowing that would only make things worse. There was no good path forward. Every road led to the same end, a meeting with one of the most feared war chiefs in Texas. As if his thoughts had summoned it, a new sound rolled across the plains. The distant beat of war drums, drawing closer with every pulse. Bear felt the cold settle into his veins. They were not waiting for daylight. The Comanche were coming tonight. Bear hurried back inside the cabin, his thoughts spiraling as the war drums grew louder, their rhythm now sharp and distinct. Each beat felt deliberate, measured, and deeply unsettling. This was not the wild chaos of a sudden raid. This was organized. Purposeful. Deadly. The girl stirred in the chair, waking as the sound reached her ears. Her eyes flew open, and for the first time since Bear had found her, he saw immediate recognition flash across her face. She knew exactly what those drums meant. She began speaking rapidly in Comanche, her voice urgent, pointing toward the door and then back at herself. Even without understanding the language, Bear could see the fear driving her movements. She was trying to tell him something important, but the barrier between them made it impossible. Bear knelt beside her, forcing his voice to stay calm despite the pounding in his chest. "I know you can't understand me, little one, but I'm trying to help you. Those drums, that's your people coming, isn't it?" She nodded fiercely, then grabbed his shirt and tugged him toward the window. She pointed outside and raised both hands, opening and closing her fingers as she counted. Bear followed the motion silently. 10. 20. 30. She continued until she reached what could only be 200. Bear's legs nearly gave out. 200 warriors. He had foolishly hoped for a small search party, maybe a handful of angry men he could reason with. 200 was enough to wipe out every ranch for miles. The drums stopped without warning, and the sudden silence felt heavier than the sound ever had. Bear moved to the window and peered into the darkness. At first, there was nothing. Then shapes emerged, as if the night itself were giving birth to them. Riders appeared in perfect formation, mounted warriors spreading out in a wide arc that slowly closed around his property. Moonlight glinted off feathers, war paint, and weapons. These men had not come to talk. The girl pulled at Bear's sleeve again, gesturing toward herself and then the door. She wanted to go to them. Bear's mind raced. Would that calm things or make them worse? What if they believed he had harmed her? What if they thought she had been taken by force? A voice cut through the darkness, strong and unmistakable, speaking English with a heavy accent but absolute clarity. "White man, we know you have taken what belongs to us. Send out the girl, and perhaps you will live to see morning." Bear swallowed hard. The authority in that voice left no doubt. This was Chief White Bull. Bear had heard the stories. A leader who united tribes. A war chief who had never lost to the cavalry. Now Bear stood on the edge of a conversation that could end with his death. He stepped toward the door, but the girl seized his arm with surprising strength. She shook her head frantically, pointed to herself, then drew her hand across her throat. She was warning him. Then understanding struck like lightning. She was not just White Bull's daughter. She was his only daughter. In Comanche culture, that made her priceless, not only as family but as the future of the bloodline. If anything had happened to her while under Bear's roof, even by accident, White Bull would have no choice but to make an unforgettable example of him. Bear realized with growing dread that saving her life had been the simple part. Now he had to convince 200 armed warriors that he had saved her, not stolen her. And he had seconds to do it. Bear made the hardest choice of his life. He opened the cabin door and stepped outside, his hands raised, the girl close behind him. The sight before him felt unreal. 200 Comanche warriors sat mounted in a perfect circle around his land. War paint shone under the moon, every weapon trained on him. At the front sat a man who could only be Chief White Bull, tall and imposing, silver streaking his long dark hair, eyes burning with restrained fury. The girl ran toward her father, calling out in Comanche. Bear expected relief, reunion, joy. Instead, White Bull's face darkened further. The chief dismounted and knelt, examining his daughter closely as she spoke fast, gesturing back toward Bear's cabin. Bear could not understand the words, but he understood the tension in White Bull's body. Every muscle was coiled, ready to unleash violence. Whatever she was saying was not easing his anger. White Bull rose and walked toward Bear, each step slow and deliberate. The warriors remained mounted, but weapons shifted, the sound like rattlesnakes preparing to strike. "My daughter tells me you fed her," White Bull said, his voice cold and controlled. "She says you gave her shelter." He stopped close enough for Bear to see the scars etched across his chest, marks of battle survived. "Yes," Bear answered. "She was starving. I couldn't let a child die." White Bull studied him. "She also says you saw the sacred beads of my family. You knew who she was, yet you did not return her immediately." Bear's chest tightened. "I planned to bring her back in the morning. She was too weak to travel at night." "Perhaps," White Bull replied. "Or perhaps you meant to keep her. To trade her for cattle, horses, safe passage." The accusation hung heavy. 200 eyes burned into Bear. "That's not true," Bear said. "I wanted nothing. I only helped her." White Bull raised his hand. Instantly, 200 bows were drawn in perfect unison. The sound of arrows being knocked felt like death inhaling. "You will prove your words," the chief said softly, "or you will die here." Bear's thoughts raced as he stared at the arrowheads shining in the moonlight. Then an idea struck. "Your daughter wore this when I found her," Bear said slowly, reaching into his pocket. Every warrior tensed. He withdrew a torn piece of cloth, snagged earlier on his fence. "I kept it as proof I did not harm her." White Bull examined it, recognition flickering. It was from her ceremonial dress. "She came to my water," Bear continued. I could have driven her away. I could have shot her. Instead, I carried her home, fed her, gave her my blanket. I asked nothing. The girl suddenly spoke again, pulling at her father's arm and pointing toward the cabin. She ran to the door and beckoned. White Bull hesitated, then motioned for Bear to follow. Inside, the girl pointed to the chair where she slept, the empty bowl, mimed eating and resting, then pointed to Bear and smiled. White Bull's gaze shifted to the table, where a worn tintype photograph lay surrounded by dried wildflowers. It showed Bear's wife and young son, taken by cholera years earlier. "You have lost children too," White Bull said quietly. "My boy was her age," Bear replied. "Maybe that's why I helped her." White Bull held the photograph, listening as his daughter explained everything in Comanche. "You could have taken advantage," White Bull translated. "Instead, you showed kindness." Outside, the warriors murmured. White Bull set the photograph down. "My warriors came expecting a kidnapper. They expected blood. Instead, they find this. But there is still a problem. My warriors cannot return empty-handed. Some believe any white man who touches a Comanche child must pay." Voices rose outside, angry, demanding justice. White Bull met Bear's eyes. "There is only one way to satisfy honor tonight, but it will demand something from you harder than death." Broken Arrow stepped forward, blocking White Bull's path, shouting in Comanche, rage twisting his scarred face. Other warriors shifted, choosing sides. Discipline fractured. The girl pressed against Bear, trembling. Broken Arrow pointed his lance at Bear and shouted something fierce. "Stop!" Broken Arrow's shout echoed across the clearing, sharp and filled with fury. Though Bear could not understand the words, their meaning was unmistakable. Broken Arrow wanted blood. He wanted it now. Several warriors behind him shouted in agreement, their voices overlapping, the tension snapping like a rope pulled too tight. White Bull did not turn immediately. He stood still, his back straight, his presence alone enough to hold the chaos at bay for a moment longer. Then he faced Broken Arrow, his voice calm but edged with authority. He spoke in Comanche, slow and deliberate. Broken Arrow answered with equal force, stepping closer, his lance still aimed at Bear. The air felt ready to ignite. Bear realized he was witnessing something far more dangerous than a threat to his own life. This was a challenge to White Bull's leadership. The girl clung to Bear's side, her small hands gripping his shirt as if anchoring herself. More warriors began to murmur, some moving behind Broken Arrow, others remaining with their chief. The perfect order that had surrounded the cabin earlier was gone, replaced by uncertainty and anger. White Bull raised his hand again, not in threat this time, but in command. Silence rippled outward, reluctant but complete. He turned his gaze back to Bear. "My people demand justice," White Bull said. "They believe it is owed. But justice is not always paid in blood." Broken Arrow scoffed loudly and spat on the ground, speaking again in Comanche. White Bull's eyes hardened. He responded sharply, his voice cutting through the night. Broken Arrow froze, then lowered his lance slightly, though his rage did not fade. White Bull looked back at Bear. "There is a path that spares your life and satisfies my people," he said. "But it will cost you dearly." Bear nodded once. "Say it." "You will come with us," White Bull said. "You will stand before my people at dawn and tell them what you did. If they believe your heart was true, you will live. If they do not, you will die." Bear felt the weight of those words settle deep. No trial. No guarantee. Only judgment. "And if I refuse?" Bear asked. "Then you die here," White Bull replied simply. Bear glanced down at the girl. Her eyes were wide, pleading. He thought of his lost son, of the photograph on the table, of the quiet life he had tried to live. "I'll go," Bear said. A ripple of reaction moved through the warriors. Some shouted in approval, others in anger. Broken Arrow stepped forward again, but White Bull silenced him with a look. "Prepare the horses," White Bull commanded. "At first light, we ride." 2 warriors dismounted and approached Bear, binding his hands not roughly, but firmly. White Bull noticed Bear's eyes flick to the girl. "She will stay with me," the chief said. "No harm will come to her." The night passed slowly. Bear was placed under guard but not mistreated. As the first hint of dawn colored the horizon, the Comanche camp came into view, vast and alive with movement. Bear was led to the center, where the tribe gathered. White Bull spoke first, recounting the search, the fear for his daughter, the arrival at the ranch. Then Bear was brought forward. His hands were freed. "Speak," White Bull said. Bear told everything. How he found her. How she was starving. How he fed her and gave her shelter. He did not beg. He did not justify beyond truth. When he finished, silence fell. Then the girl stepped forward. She spoke clearly and without fear, her words flowing fast and sure. White Bull translated as she spoke. She told them how Bear carried her, how he shared his food, how he never touched her in harm. Murmurs spread. Some warriors nodded. Others remained stone-faced. Broken Arrow shouted again, accusing Bear of deceit. White Bull let the voices rise, then raised his hand. "Enough." He turned to Bear. "You risked your life for my child," White Bull said. "You showed mercy where none was expected. Today, mercy is returned." He lifted his voice so all could hear. "Thaddeus Bear Malister is under my protection. Any who challenge this challenge me." The camp fell silent. Broken Arrow stared, then turned away, defeated but not reconciled. White Bull stepped closer to Bear. "Go," he said. "Live." Bear bowed his head once. The girl ran to him and hugged him fiercely before being pulled back gently. Bear was escorted to the edge of the camp, his horse waiting. As he rode away, the sun rose fully over the plains. Behind him stood 200 warriors who had come for blood and left with a story they would tell for generations. Bear did not look back. He rode home, knowing he had crossed a line few ever survived, and that kindness, once given, could echo louder than war drums ever could.